Well, welcome to all of you. We're here gathered to discuss marriage, its purpose, its place in our lives. My name is Jeff White. I'm a pastor at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in the downtown congregation. I've been doing marriage counseling and pre-marriage counseling for 25 years, both with couples who are sort of eagerly anticipating marriage, as well as with those who are in the thick of the difficulties of marriage at times. And my pleasure to sort of host our conversations. To my right is Tim Keller. He's the senior pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church for the past 25 years, been married to his wife, Kathy, for 40 years, and the author of the book, The Meaning of Marriage. To my right here is Joe and Kristen. They've been married for 11 years now and have a 4-year-old. And to my left, Sam and Tara, who have been married 5 years and have a 2-year-old at this time. We want to talk a little bit about the purpose of marriage. The role that it plays in our lives, what we're expecting out of it. And let me just begin with that simple question, which is, do you feel you went into marriage with unrealistic expectations? If so, what were they and what fueled them?
Yes. I do feel like I went in with unrealistic expectations, and I thought that the way that we felt each other was going to cover all of the difficulty. I thought it was just going to take care of everything, and it does not.
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't expect marriage to be such a process of kind of, sounds weird, but sort of understanding who I am. I kind of thought, oh, I'm going to be, getting to know my wife, and that's exciting. But now I'm finding out a lot of things about me, good things, bad things. That's sort of interesting and unexpected.
Yeah, I think for me, my expectations were unrealistic in the sense that I didn't realize there was a depth to everything that happens between us and to the things that can come up along the way. I think that really escalated with kids. So I guess, I didn't know fully what I was getting into. Maybe you never do, but I certainly didn't.
So Tim, you've been married 40 years. If you can remember back that far, did you have any unrealistic expectations with which you went into marriage?
Kathy and I, when we first got to know each other, were doing it as friends. We were graduate students together. I was supposedly, and I was at the time, spoken for. So in a sense, we felt like we could start to hang out and talk with each other about theology and about books we liked. And we got to be pretty good friends thinking, well, this isn't going to be romantic. And partly because of that, we were pretty honest with each other about our woundedness and our problems and our difficulties. And so when we did turn around and decide to get romantically involved and get married, we actually didn't get any surprises afterwards, which is almost, I hardly ever hear that from anybody else.
When we were just getting married, I saw it so much as a celebration and a solidifying kind of moment in our relationship so that there was never a question and we would move forward together. And that was definitely a part of it. As we've been married for a few years, and especially in what can be a really challenging and isolating city like New York, it's just myriad reasons why two is stronger than one. So many so that there was no way that I think I could have anticipated it as I was like, we get to have a wedding. It's just so different.
I agree. When we got married, on the day we got married, I feel like that day was really about celebration of what we had done, what our relationship had become. And what I didn't fully anticipate, what I didn't expect was how much that marriage ceremony was really about what we were about to do, not where we had been, but where we were going. And I think the thing that for me makes service so important to that, or what the point of marriage is, which this is how I think it connects to service, is that rather than looking at that marriage as something to acknowledge what we had done and where we had come, I look at our marriage now as a way of bettering one another in a way that we can't when we're alone, in a way that I can't on my own.
You can say we.
Yeah. I feel like
too.
we make each other better people. And I feel like that's what we're here to do in our marriage.
Why is service so important to marriage? Why is it necessary that it's a real central practice in the life of our relationships?
Well, I think in a lot of ways it's because service helps me to remember that my marriage is not about me. My marriage is about this engagement with this other person and what is happening in our lives. And as Christians, we believe that it's what God is doing in our lives. So in the ways that I'm called to serve Joe, I love him and want the best for him. And so in my best moments, that I'm able to get outside myself and do that. And that service causes our relationship to flourish.
I think the purpose of marriage has kind of got a horizontal and a vertical level. Let me just talk about the horizontal, the service side. This doesn't exhaust the question. But the service side, I completely agree with what's being said. The purpose of marriage is actually character change and community building, and they go together. So when I serve my spouse, it's changing me and changing her, and it's creating a community. It actually, not only if you're blessed with children, not only does it create the community the children need to thrive, but actually even friends and neighbors and other people around you in some ways get shelter in that community too. But here's something I can say to you, because you both have young children. One of the things that what struck me by the time my kids were adolescents is, with children, you are more unconditionally committed to your children than your spouse. At a functional level. You never took a vow. The fact is that when your spouse isn't what she ought to be, you tend to pull back. There's all that conditionality that works in there. With your kids, they're so helpless that even when they're screaming, even when they're this or that, you just gotta do what you have to do. So I realized by the time they were adolescents, I served my children no matter how they behaved. And by the time they were adolescents, I realized my heart was so bound up with them. When you act loving toward someone as unrelentingly as you do to your children, you start to feel this incredible love. It follows. And by the time my kids were adolescents, I realized I will do anything. I would die for these people. And it doesn't matter how they behave. I will never, ever give up on them. And then I said, do I feel quite that way with my wife?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly well said, and it reminds, or makes me think that sort of inherently in couples, actually regardless of their faith commitments, there is a certain reflection of at least what the biblical perspective on marriage is, which is, at least among the ways that the Bible puts forward the purpose of marriage, it says it's meant to be a picture, a parable of the relationship between God and his people, particularly as that's manifested in Jesus giving himself for the church, that it might flourish, that it might be healed, that his people might be whole. And there's this deep sense of we are called to sort of mirror that relationship with our spouse.
It's something that's hard to look at and think that I could actually achieve. Honestly, it's like, wow, he's perfect in his pursuit of us. How can I be perfect in the way that I'm, in a way, pursuing my wife through loving her and taking care of her and being there for her?
Yeah. Sam and Tara, I know you all don't share the Christian faith commitments, and yet I know you're interacting with those commitments and been reflecting on them. Just when you hear that as the Christian's understanding of the purpose of marriage, to be this picture of the relationship between God and his people, that is what undergirds it. What's your reaction to that?
Of course, I don't see our marriage in the same picture with the same characters, but I absolutely can't deny or disagree with what for me feels like the fact that our marriage is healed and bettered constantly through serving each other. And the beliefs and the traditions that I do come from, I think actually it's not the same picture, but those pictures have a lot of common elements.
Jeff just said that the Christian understanding is that marriage is a reflection. Our human marriage is a reflection of the relationship between God, between Christ and his church, between God and his people. And I think that functionally works two ways. And on the one hand, for Christians, it gives us the obligation to serve. In other words, which actually you already feel, regardless of in other words, you already feel this obligation, and that is that I shouldn't be selfish here. I really need to give myself. Now, the Christian, if I believe in the Christian gospel, then I realize I'm living by the commitment of someone who sacrificed for me. So how dare I live on that and accept that and then not give it to anybody else? So part of it is an obligation which you can feel I think whether you are a Christian or not, and I do, plenty of people feel that, and you were just talking about that. But the other thing that gives you is a resource. If my spouse isn't loving me like I'd like her to love me, but I feel awash in love from other sources, it's a little really affirmed, really adored elsewhere, then it's a little easier for me to be generous. And that's what relationship with Jesus does. In other words, my relationship with God is not a kind of a tit for tat. If I'm a good person, then he blesses me, which is a more traditional religious approach. It's like I'm received and accepted because of what Jesus Christ did for me at infinite cost to himself. He sacrificed himself for me. Well, Christians meditate on that and actually feel the love, experience it. And then that makes it easier for me, frankly, to give when I am not getting. And so on the one hand, the vertical is a kind of obligation. He did this for me, I need to do this for my wife. But on the other hand, it actually makes me want to do it. It gives me the power to do it. And in that sense, the vertical is really important for the horizontal. I think the horizontal, without the vertical relationship, would be pretty exhausting long run.
Yeah, I think it can go on fairly well for a good period of time as long as both people are feeling fairly refreshed and able to give. But I frequently would say to couples, hey, your job is not to love each other on the basis of the love you get from the other person, because some days it just isn't there.
I add a practical dark note.
Yes.
If you don't, since you will go through those difficult patches in your marriage, if you don't have, you might say, the divine source for the love that you're not getting from your spouse, at least not enough right now, is you look for it elsewhere. I'd say the most natural and probably the least destructive thing to do is to get it from the children. In other words, you say, well, I'm going to be, I'll give myself to my child or my children, and they're going to love me back. But in the long run, that's not good either. It's not good for the kids, and it's not good for the marriage. But that's the natural thing, is to say, I'm going to have to get love from somewhere, because right now I'm having trouble giving it and getting it here. And my experience with my relationship with God is if I go to him for it, I'm able to give even when the other person is tired or sick or just not able to give that much, and then things don't go off the rails. But if I try to find it in some other human source, things do go off the rails.
Yeah. I think it's also, I think it's also the idea that like my spouse or my kids can't bear up under the burden of that source of meaning that I'm trying to get from them, or that source of my happiness or my okayness or whatever. They can't withstand that.
I think for the two of us, that the source of that love takes a different shape outside of the Christian church. It's a little more maybe complex in some ways, or just different. But I agree wholeheartedly that there has to be something there outside the two of us. And we have this image, this idea that, it's a very romantic kind of American story, it's you and me against the world, babe. And I think that that's a trap.
Well, and I also feel Joe mentioned the idea that I can't hold up under the burden of what he needs. I'm also ultimately disappointing. At some point, we actually not only fail each other, but we hurt each other, and I feel like that also plays into the idea of why you don't want to serve. At some point, maybe it's not just that you've sort of casually pulled away from each other, but you've actually inflicted wounds.
It's self-preservation.
On each other. Yeah, and you're like, well,
not
fine.
Giving it, yeah.
Earlier in our discussion with regards to the purpose, you're mentioning that there is this inherent sense of needing to serve each other, essentially. And it strikes me that reflects very much on what the Bible says the purpose of marriage is. In Ephesians 5, the Apostle Paul is writing this grand chapter about marriage and how it works out in our lives. And he essentially says that one of the chief purposes of marriage is that it's meant to be a picture, a parable of Christ in the church. It's to show forth the gospel message.
Well, probably the biblical passage on marriage in the Bible is Ephesians 5. It's also, by the way, linked. He actually quotes Genesis 2, which is the other major passage in the Bible on marriage. And there, to me, the nub of it is here, where he says, husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it, to present her radiant, holy, blameless. Now, right there you have the gospel. First of all, you have Jesus Christ not saying to us, if you do all these things, then I'll love you. But instead, he didn't die for us because we were lovely. He died to make us lovely. That's what it says. He sacrificed himself, gave himself, in order to make us radiant and holy and blameless, which I think probably means two things, especially since Paul's doing this. Paul would say, on the one hand, you're immediately accepted by God when Jesus Christ dies for you and you believe in him. You're accepted, you're justified. But then slowly, as time goes on, he's also sanctifying you and turning you into something really beautiful and really holy, a person of love and joy and peace and humility and faithfulness and kindness and self-control. And so that's what Jesus has done. Now, marriage. Paul turns right around and says, husbands and wives, the implication is husbands and wives both do that for each other. You give yourself for each other. And on the one hand, you're loving each other and accepting each other now. You're doing it by grace. You're doing it unconditionally. And yet, you're not going to let the other person stay in the unhealthy place they might be. You're going to try to goad them on, never saying, I won't love you unless you change, but saying, because I love you, please change, and bring that person to become more and more of a radiant, holy person. And so it's all there. The gospel is there, and marriage is supposed to be based on the gospel.
Sam, Tara, your reaction to this biblical idea that marriage, among other things, has this purpose of reflecting the relationship of God to his people, and it provides both a source, a love, as well as an example?
Well, I think for me, as a non-Christian, I absolutely feel like I need to find models and resources to support our marriage that are more than just between the two of us. And those aren't always easy to find. We find them in our community, we find them in our friends, we find them in our philosophy and our beliefs, and the common ground that we share, and the recognition that we are a couple in something so much bigger than the two of us. And I think that we're working in our best ways for the betterment of not just ourselves, not just our family, but the people we love and even the people we don't love. But that is hard. I'll be frank, I find the picture enviable, because I think for us it's much more complex. And Tim, you and I have spoken about this in the past, but I do feel like sometimes when we can't look just to one common deep well, we get into trouble when we're looking in different directions. We get into trouble when a well we expect to be a deep resource isn't as deep or is a lot drier than we expected. But I do think there's a balance that comes for us from this tension of many different sources of support, none of which are infinite, none of which are always reliable, but there's a web there that has been so far enough to hold us.
Well, and one thing that I think we've done in order to improvise kind of around our lack of a central well is try and be certain to communicate during non-crisis times in preparation for those times, especially since we have gone through some hard times and seen how difficult it can be in the moment when we're already depleted and exhausted emotionally and physically, and to make sure that we practice, for lack of a better term, to prepare for the time when it does come again, and make sure that we understand our pitfalls, our own personal pitfalls, and try and look in the same direction so that we can stay together as a union and help each other through difficult times instead of trying to retreat and nurse our own wounds individually. And that keeps us strong.
Yeah, and I think that, I'll be honest, when I hear that passage, when I hear you talk about how it relates to your own marriage, I think to myself, I'm like, wow, it would be great if God had our back. That's quite a team.
The gospel, at essence, is God has graciously given his son for us. He spared not his son, and won't he graciously give us all things? And therefore, it takes care of that scarcity issue that you mentioned. If God's given his son, he's not going to hold anything back. I'm always going to have plenty to give. I'm set free to serve. That's our conversation for now.
I love that whole session. I think it'd be a good idea for us just to emphasize a couple of points. Kristen, I think, really made a very important point when she said that she discovered her marriage was really about service, and it really wasn't about just enriching her life. It was about giving more than receiving. That could actually sound almost trite, but it's essential. We have a culture in which people are taught that everything they bring into their life is to help make them successful and realize their potential. So marriage ends up being just another enrichment program almost.
Yeah, right.
And she understood that basically it's only on the far side of service that you do get blessed in marriage. When I say I'm not here to think about myself, but my husband, and to serve God, eventually character is changed. You grow and your spouse grows. There was another terrific section in that first session in which Sam and Tara talked about the fact that whereas they did not have their feet firmly in the Christian faith at all, nevertheless, they in some ways saw the need for outside resources for their marriage, spiritual resources. And they actually envied the discussion that we had in which Christians were saying we have resources for our marriage.
That's a good thing.
It was great that they did that. In fact, I would actually say that they were ahead of an awful lot of Christians in understanding that they need resources for their marriage. Here's just a couple ideas on the kind of resources you do have for your marriage if you're a Christian. You might say the most basic level, it's just a knowledge that God's in your marriage. When you say your vows are always also said to God. And here's one more. I don't think without the grace of God that comes to you in the gospel, the knowledge that you are accepted by God, the love that you're getting from God, an unconditional love, not based on how well you're doing this day or that day, unless you have that, you can't, first of all, admit your own flaws to your spouse. You need a certain spiritual strength in your life where you feel loved enough by God that you can admit when you're wrong. If you can't admit where you're wrong, your marriage will never move forward. But it's also true that since your spouse is not your Savior, God's your Savior, and your spouse's love, as important as that love is not the ultimate love of your life.
Well, Ephesians 5, which we already talked about, gives you actually the template for the whole thing, because in there we're shown a picture of Jesus treating the church the way the husband's supposed to interact with his wife, and you get a whole gospel reenactment thing going on in your marriage where you are painfully sometimes, it's not always painful, but sometimes painfully serving one another with unconditional love, or forgiving something that really, really hurt, or loving one another, or asking for forgiveness for yourself. You tell the truth, you ask for forgiveness. All of that enables other people to see an embodied version of the gospel. That's why gospel reenactment is such a good word. The support of the vow and the covenant that really upholds your marriage and keeps it together, no matter how messed up you get, no matter how disappointed you get, no matter how bad things are, really deserves a session of its own, I think. And that's what we're going to get to next. So come back, we'll be here, and that's what we'll talk about. See you then.